Jorge Martin added 20 points to his MotoGP championship lead at Misano on Sunday. Didn't add 25 though, and that was because of Enea Bastianini's forceful last lap move for the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix win. That move, the talk of the town coming out of the weekend. Opinions split. Bastianini very defiant, obviously. Martin quite annoyed and struggling not to be more annoyed with every moment, obviously. But a lot of mixed opinions from their peers. Simon, what do you think this particular move has divided the MotoGP field and the MotoGP paddock so?
I think that the fundamental thing for me is that there's two things. One is that I'm not sure that this move would have come from Enea Bastianini against, say, Pecco Bagnaia, and I'm not sure that this is a move that any other Ducati rider would have put on either Martin or Bagnaia, given that the two of them are kind of in this title race between them. The other factor in it, I think, that has caused a bit of controversy, especially within MotoGP, is that this is essentially a changing of the rules somewhat. It's a new precedent in terms of what you can get away with on track, and going into 6 final rounds of the championship where we expect Martin and Bagnaia to be banging ferns on track, it could change how the rest of the season plays out. So not really a surprise that there's been quite a bit of controversy around this.
Do you think the move was on? Just reviewing it back in your head right now.
I mean, it was the sort of move that we've come to expect in MotoGP right now, because it's the sort of move that really you have to make to get past, especially towards the end of a race with this current generation of Michelin front tyre, where when the front pressure and temperature goes up, it becomes really, really difficult to get much feeling into them. It becomes difficult to make the kind of back and forth last lap passes that we expected in the past from, battles between Marc Marquez and Andrea Dovizioso or Fabio Quartararo. Times are different now. You have to do things in a slightly different way, and I understand why Bastianini made the move, because I think it was the only way he was going to get past Jorge Martin, given the good job that Martin was doing of defensive riding. I think maybe what happened in the moment of contact exaggerated a little bit just how severe the move was. But the reality of it is Bastianini made a hard, aggressive overtake, but he was going to make the corner. It wasn't like he was, for example, trying to use Martin as a brake or a berm, the way that we've seen from other incidents. He held his line. He ran off track a little bit at the end, but I think that was extenuating circumstances. And it was a hard racing move, but as someone that has always been quite the fan of hard racing moves and has always been a proponent of rubbing his racing, I'm not too opposed to it. Even if I think there's still going to be significant fallout from what we saw.
I think the perception in the paddock, and whether it's right or not, we do not know, because the move was not officially placed under investigation, which means there has not been an official reasoning for why it wasn't a penalty. There was no specific mention of last lap lenience, but certainly, we've heard the theory that if this was in race, lower stakes, there would have been an in race reversal. There would have been a drop one position. And I think we've seen similar things happen in race, similar moves be reversed. But you could also, I guess, argue that we've seen similar moves not get reversed. And it's never 1-to-1. What do you think? Should there have been an investigation? Would that have placated people? Some mentioned a long lap penalty of 3 seconds, which would have kept Bastianini the winner anyway.
I mean, I definitely think there should have been an investigation into it, and I'm quite surprised that there wasn't, to be honest. We know that there's a framework around how the stewards do things, but we don't know what it says. Maybe it's possible that it does say in there that there's a bit of last lap leniency, but if that is the case, it would have been very easy for them to say incident under investigation, given it all it needs is 30 seconds to say no further action, because then that would have meant that whenever it came to the end of day stewards report, at least there would have been room to put in a paragraph to say, under the rules, under the framework, we give a bit more leniency to the last lap moves, etc., basically to explain a little bit about what happened. Instead, we've been left once again kind of in the dark with regards to their thought process, and I understand why there's frustration coming from people whenever they don't know what that thought process has been that led to no penalty. I think it's a little bit of an own goal that could have been avoided with better communication, because if they'd explained their thinking, people would have been automatically less irate about it. Those who are irate about it, as opposed to, people like myself who think it's not that unfair. We have seen other moves, similar moves, get penalised in the past, and I think that's part of where this confusion is coming from people. We've seen moves with arguably lesser consequences get pretty harshly penalised in the past. Long lap penalties, time deductions, things like that. I didn't think, like I said, that Bastianini necessarily deserved a penalty after the race, but I was expecting one. I expected one right up until basically we saw them, confirmed as race winners in Parc Fermé. I thought at least maybe they'll throw him a 3-second long lap penalty time equivalent for causing contact with another rider and sending them off the track. That would have meant that he kept the win, but it would have at least conformed to what we've expected or what we've seen from the rules in the past. That didn't happen. As it is, we're a little bit in the dark still about why it played out the way it did, but I think ultimately the right decision was made.
Yeah, there's two questions here. One is procedural, and the other is philosophical, I guess. Procedural is, should this kind of, does this fit the precedent? And the entire MotoGP grid exists under the understanding right now that the current stewarding panel, led by 500cc and 250cc champion Freddie Spencer, will probably not quite function the same way as its successor in 25, led by current MotoGP pit lane reporter Simon Crafar. So there's sort of a feeling of, let's just do the things the way we do them now for the remaining races, and then start from a clean slate. But you could also, I think you will not find much agreement in MotoGP between riders over whether the fact that Bastianini did make the corner. I think you could argue over the subsequent runoff, but I think he was going to make the corner if he didn't check on Martin. You could ask whether he was in control enough and whether he left Martin enough of a recourse to tackle the corner, and whether that matters, or whether at the point that he arrived at the apex, the corner is already his and it doesn't really matter where Martin goes. I don't know. I think, Simon, you stand on hard racing. Is that influenced by the fact that overtaking is harder now than before?
I mean, I don't think it is, because whenever you look back, we've always seen these hard moves in racing. Whenever Pedro Acosta was asked about the incident after the race, he essentially reeled off a list of previous incidents that have been kind of widely celebrated in the sport, many of them involving Valentino Rossi doing similar things. So there's always been this level of hard racing to an extent. I think it's probably made worse by the fact that it was Bastianini's home race, that the guy he was fighting against is fighting his teammate for the championship, and it was good for team morale to take some points off him, and the fact that Martin is a hard guy to pass. He's aggressive and he runs a good fast defensive line. So I think kind of culmination of all of those things, he knew that he had to do something a bit rash. It's beyond the usual block pass. Like, let's be perfectly clear about that, because a block pass is about essentially messing up the way that your rival comes out of the corner rather than goes into it. It's not about interfering with their braking as such, and that's what he did. He got in the way of Martin's braking by appearing where Martin didn't expect him to be, but he didn't take a particularly weird line. Martin left the door open a little bit. Bastianini went for the gap. He is a very, very aggressive late breaker, so that kind of fits with his style as well. I don't think it was a particularly, lungy move or super, super aggressive, but, the consequences obviously are pretty significant.
Let's talk bigger picture. As you've mentioned already, there is an extra spiciness to this move by the fact that it was Bastianini on his teammate's title rival. There is also sort of a backdrop that I find very interesting, which is that, yes, Jorge Martin is in his second one-on-one title battle with Pecco Bagnaia right now, but I would argue that his main MotoGP rival, the definitive one right now, is actually Enea Bastianini, because that's his one rivalry where we've consistently seen just that little bit of spice, that tinge of acrimony. For examples, obviously, in 423, Ducati overlooked Martin for a seat that he believed he was promised in favor of Bastianini. For 24, as Bastianini was struggling, Ducati refused to swap them around and give Martin the work seat he so badly desired. And partly that probably came because Bastianini recovered enough to win the Malaysian Grand Prix last year. Martin said of that win that it was completely enabled by the fact that Bastianini ran an illegal tire pressure, that he basically described as comically low. And under those rules, he got away with a warning. This year would have been a 16-second penalty. Also, they collided earlier this year before Bastianini was on the ground. None of this is why Bastianini made the move. Let's make this clear. This is not like a personal grudge thing. Bastianini made the move because he wanted to win at home and he wanted to win, and he's still sort of in this title fight. But I'm not convinced that Bastianini would have made it on Bagnaia, and I'm not convinced that any Ducati rider who's not Martin would have made it on Bagnaia. And I think you're in the same camp, Simon.
I mean, Marc Marquez would have made it on his own mother, because that's Marc Marquez and that's where he is right now to win races. But I get your point. I definitely get what you mean. I think Bastianini wouldn't have made the move on Pecco Bagnaia because he's a bit too much of a team player. But I think outside of that, maybe, I mean, the Ducati, that kind of internal politics is a little bit skewed by the addition of the VR46 Academy as well. Because, for example, Marco Bezzecchi wouldn't have made that move on Pecco Bagnaia, but that's probably not because they're both Ducati riders. I think both Marquez brothers would have made it. I mean, we've already seen Alex Marquez more than happy to interfere in the title fight by coming together with Pecco Bagnaia. But I think there is something to your theory of a little bit of tension between the two of them. I think not so much, it's maybe a bit one-sided because Jorge Martin is a guy with a chip on his shoulder who carries a grudge. It's one of the best things about him because it makes him such an interesting character. Enea Bastianini is much more laid back, but there's a stubbornness that comes with being that as well. And I think it was just very much a desire not to give an inch on his behalf. He was going to do whatever he needed to do to win the race, and he didn't really care who he was riding against. I understand why that's kind of manifested into even more frustration from Jorge Martin, and it's probably going to increase that rivalry a little bit more, even going into next year, whenever the two of them are probably going to find themselves, in competition quite a bit on two different manufacturers' bikes that are fairly similar levels. So it's going to roll on, thankfully, because it's good entertainment. But I don't know if it was a deciding factor in the move, but it was certainly not something that would have happened between two factory red bikes, at least at this point in the season.
Yeah, and you mentioned Bezzecchi. I mean, the guy I'm thinking of is Martin's de facto teammate, Franco Morbidelli, also VR46. So there's an extra complicated layer there. For some people, this might seem completely normal, Ducati teammates favoring each other, etc. But you should remember, Jorge Martin, until the 31st of December, is also a Ducati contracted rider. A Martin title would be a Ducati title. There's a whole host of weird interpolitics going on there. But let's go to Bagnaia now, because ultimately none of that will matter if he keeps doing what he did this Sunday in Misano. Had a sort of a weird tire race. His rear tire didn't come on. He was very angry about that until in the middle of the race it switched on and he did 3 laps basically in 1 minute 30 lap record range. Then he fell off. Was more angry about the tire than about the fall, but it's 16 points in the trash coming into a strong run of races for Martin. Do you think Bagnaia will regret this? How do you feel about this mistake? Because it feels like we've seen this kind of sort of movie before, and he's maybe not as upset about it as he should be?
I think he's probably not as upset about it as he should be, because as far as he's concerned, it's not his fault, it's someone else's. And imagine he's pretty target fixated right now in this being a Michelin fault. Obviously, he had the issue early on in the race that was really bizarre, and I think kind of perplexed pretty much every rider that we spoke to about it, because this doesn't even fit with what we expect as unpredictable from Michelin sometimes. It was a really, really odd situation that he found himself in, where the front tire just wouldn't come up to temperature. But he also kind of alluded to, the tire just went from him whenever it came to that crash. And whenever you look back at the crash, I mean, it almost looks like a wet weather fall. It comes so early in the braking. It's really unusual. So I think that he's going to be telling himself that this is not his fault. This is not his error or his mistake. This is something that's happened because he has, as far as he's concerned, once again been given a tire that wasn't consistent. And with that in mind, that's going to be his kind of psychological buffer for himself going forward. This is going to be what he's telling himself going straight into another race weekend, that he did nothing wrong. And that, maybe Martin will get a bad tire this weekend and that'll swing things back in his favour, because that kind of seems to be where we are right now. It's an odd position. It's something that he spoke out about after the race, about concerns that essentially our one-make tire manufacturer is having a considerable impact on who wins the championship, which is Not something new to this year either. We saw it last year with Martin, claiming a bad tyre in Qatar right at the crunch point of the championship battle. It's difficult to put too much blame on Bagnaia, I think, because clearly something was up. The race that he ran was so wildly different from the race that we knew he had the potential to run. And the fact that he was able to come back mid-race and do something like really, really impressive with those few laps where he was suddenly rapid and suddenly closing up on the leaders. Maybe he made a mistake at that point, pushing a little bit too hard, trying to chase them up. Maybe he didn't and the tyre was still acting funny. No one is ever really going to know the answer to that, because even if Michelin find the answer to that, they're not going to tell us. I think it's one to chalk down to really, really weird circumstances, because that's exactly what Bagnaia is going to be doing with this incident.